First of all, thank you both for joining us. We've had an interesting morning program. We had some great conversations around some really neat innovations that are happening related to food safety, technological innovation and educational innovation. We went higher level and talked about opportunities for public-private partnerships and for the private sector to engage in public dialogues that enhance and increase trade and improve food safety. And then you just heard the last panel where we were talking about opportunities to strengthen the relationship between the U.S. and China that enables our economies to continue trading with each other. We have two fantastic staff from Congress. We've heard much today about the conversations between our administration's dialogue with China. But we've got an interesting system of government here in the United States. I've heard that Congress is an equal branch of the government, correct? And,
It still is.
and has its own perspective on engagement and trade with foreign partners. That said, we have two fantastic staff here. Jason Thielman is with Senator Steve Daines, and Tara Sabag is with Congressman Rick Larsen. Senator Daines represents the great state of Montana, a state where some of you may know a lot of beef is produced. But unlike most members of the U.S. Senate, Senator Daines is uniquely positioned to have a very thoughtful perspective on China. Before coming to Congress, he was a businessman. He worked for Procter & Gamble for 13 years. 6 of those years were in China, where he set up factories. So he has more experience than most members of Congress. Has also been a huge proponent of increasing agricultural trade from the United States to China. Tara works for Congressman Rick Larsen, who has been in the House of Representatives since 2001. The congressman represents the west coast of Washington State. What's his interest there? Maybe a large manufacturer is based in his state? Small manufacturer? Boeing. Tara's boss represents a lot of Boeing manufacturing, which is the largest manufacturer in the United States and largest exporter to China. Both Tara and Jason have had a lot of experience with their bosses, focusing and working on China issues and really working towards a constructive dialogue between our two countries that's beneficial for all of those involved. Since your bosses aren't able to be here today, it's a travel day for Congress. We wanted to offer you both an opportunity to share your bosses' perspectives on where we are today and what outcomes they would like to see in these dialogues between the U.S. and China, and what you're pushing the administration towards. So with that, Jason, let me turn it to you to kick off. Thank you.
Do we need that? Great. Thank you so much, Tress. I appreciate the opportunity to be here on behalf of Senator Daines. To begin with, in response to your comments, one of the points that the senator likes to make when he has the opportunity to be before a group like this is just a stage setting of what really is the relative opportunity and how we need to look at global trade and the place of the United States. And to begin with, 96% of the world's consumers are outside of the United States. And we need to begin in looking at our engagement and our opportunity with that context in mind. A second important stat that I think is lost on most of us in the United States, if not beyond, is does anyone know who had the largest economy in the world on the eve of the American Revolution? I don't have any prize. Tress, do you have any prizes we can give if somebody gets this right, or something to do to kind of coax people out of their shells? All right, I'll spare you the anticipation and suspense here. It was China. And for most of the preceding 1,000 years or longer, it was China as well. And it was only very recently that what China refers to as its century of humiliation, that China was not the leading economy in the world. That is a relatively recent phenomenon, although it seems like a permanent state of affairs from our perspective. Another, I think, important stage-setting concept and how my boss approaches this with the administration and others is when you look at what has been the greatest force for good in the history of humanity, it is an open markets, free trade, and our economic concept of capitalism. And the result of that, looking especially past World War II with the rules-based system that we set up, has really provided a guarantee of relative peace and harmony in the world. Because for the first time, relatively speaking, really almost in the history of the world, people's nations' access to goods and services and markets and products they need has not been in question. It's been secured. And that is the primary underlying reason that nations find themselves going to war, is a concern over that security. And the concept of free trade and free markets with this American guarantee and this system of this rules-based system has lifted more people out of poverty than any other concept in the history of humanity. And we need to stand boldly for that in all of our conversations. There's no doubt there are significant concerns with, someone mentioned earlier that China is somewhere between a command economy and a capitalist economy. I think another way of looking at that is it's a sort of a mercantilist economy. And that does create a great number of challenges to the United States and to the world. And we need to address that. China is no longer a developing economy, it's a developed economy. People underestimate the level of innovation that is going on in China today. It's not a backwards country by any means. And in some important ways, they've even leapfrogged the United States, such as in quantum computing. But we need to make sure that we do maintain this rules-based system, and that can't happen in a unilateral way. We need to have a multilateral approach. And that's one of the points that my bosses most strongly emphasize to the administration.
Thanks so much, Jason.
Okay.
Tara?
Does this work? Can everyone hear me? Okay. So Congressman Larson wholeheartedly agrees, also believes in the rules-based system and a multilateral approach, which is why he's been a little critical, maybe a lot critical, of the administration's approach on trade. He believes that this strategic framework of a rules-based system is put in place of this tit-for-tat tariff trade policy, which he likes to say is out of the 1880s. Or he likes to say it's out of the 80s, and by 80s he means 1880s. But it was actually proven when President Trump gave his announcement on 232. He mentioned the 1890 McKinley Act, and so we were off by just a year. Washington State is the most trade-dependent state in the nation. 40% of all jobs in Washington State are trade-dependent. In one of the counties that Congressman Larson represents, it's 60%. That's where Boeing is located. Brookings Institute actually put a study together saying that the most impacted district in the entire country, if there were a trade war with China, would be his district. So for us, there's a lot at stake, and we take that very, very seriously. And the consequences are, we've already seen some of them. It's not just this fear that there's going to be a trade war, but it's also that we're neglecting the system that we put in place. It's that we're upsetting our allies. We saw that with EU and India, which they've already decided to impose tariffs on Washington State apples, and we're starting to see the ramifications of some of this. Today, or this weekend, it looked like that there was a little bit of a positive sign in some of the discussions between the U.S. and China with regard to trade. Congressman Larson is going to put out a statement today saying the exact opposite, that this flea bargain-like tactic is ignoring the strategic approach that we need while tackling our trade deficit with China, or it's lacking the multilateral approach. And that in order to really get at the heart of this, we need to go back to how we've started this system since World War II. And that's about it.
Thanks for that. I'm going to ask a question that's going to be difficult to answer because you can't channel the entire Congress, but there are 535 members of Congress and probably 535 opinions on how we should approach engagement in trade conversations with China. But based on what your bosses have said and where they've engaged and participated in the past, do they have suggestions on what Congress's role will be in guiding conversations and addressing some of these issues that need to be addressed, but still enable us to have a positive engagement with China and encourage deepening economic relationships and opportunities for those that you represent, either in the agriculture sector or manufacturing sector, and giving them opportunities to continue selling into that market?
Tress, I think you made an observation here which underscores what is most lacking in Congress. You said there's 535 members and there are probably 535 opinions, therefore, on how we should approach trade with China. The issue is there probably are not 535 opinions because this, out of all the issues that face a member of Congress and the tyranny of urgent that we live in on the Hill, is one that people have not given enough attention and thought to. It's one of the reasons Senator Daines took it upon himself to make certain that each year that he's been in the Senate, that he wants to take a delegation back to China to visit the country, because so few people have an understanding of what really is the most important strategic relationship facing the world today, and one, frankly, that if we don't get right and we fail to execute and find a cooperative way of working together, could have profoundly negative consequences on the world, and inversely, given the opportunity, profoundly positive consequences as well. And I think the great challenge we have here again is people are not giving it enough thought. It is not on the radar screen of most members. Real fascinating discussion. There was much comment when President Trump put forward his first national security plan and the labeling and the approach and the focus on China. I was sitting down with a member of President Bush 43's National Security Council member, and they had prepared their first draft of their national security plan, who was primarily focused on China, and that's exactly about the time that the planes from 9/11 hit, and they, needless to say, changed and pivoted away from that. But really, since that point in time, we have put our focus elsewhere in the world for some reasons that are obviously very tragic, but policy members visit the Middle East. They don't visit China. They don't visit Asia. And as a result, we don't have a pool of people that have a lot of depth in the issue or have given it a great deal of thought.
I hate to be the panelist that always agrees with what the last person said.
Bipartisanship right here.
But I completely concur with every word. Congressman Larson started the U.S.-China Working Group in the House with former Senator Kirk in 2005. He's gone back to China every year. This last September, he went back with a delegation of 6, and 5 of them, it was their very first trip. And that is so important. These trips are so important, and for members to engage on this level is very important. The only, I guess, contradiction I would make is that when some members do engage, it seems to be very reactionary, so there is focus on China, but some of it seems to be very reactionary. There are several bills now about Confucius Institutes. There are bills about taxing businesses that do business in China. There are all these bills out there about China, so there is some focus on China. And the argument that Congressman Larson would make is, instead of being so reactionary, what are we doing to invest, to compete? As mentioned before, China is ahead of us in nanotechnology. China is getting ahead of us in AI, and China is getting ahead of us in a lot of these sciences that the United States has traditionally been a leader in. So what are we doing? Where are we putting our money and where are we putting our resources? And I think as far as the entire congressional approach, we need to, Congress, I hate to say what Congress needs to do, but there seems to be more space to be more thoughtful in this approach.
Would agree with that. Thanks so much. Jason, I've heard your boss tell a story before, and I won't ask you to repeat it, but it's quite colorful about some of the things he did to help get beef back into China and open that market again. We talked a little bit about that on an earlier panel today, and I think it's, the market opening for beef, for U.S. beef, is truly illustrative of what the opportunity is for U.S. agricultural producers, farmers and ranchers getting access across a broader number of categories to the Chinese market. But you also mentioned that there are negative consequences if we don't get it right. And so if you were to tell someone what those negative consequences would be, how does it impact the state of Montana? How would it impact your boss's constituents if we don't get this dialogue right with China?
Tress, that's a great question. And just real quickly, more audience participation. Who was the, this may seem like a leading question given we're here for a Walmart-related panel, but who was the first person to export beef to China after, or just before, following the ban being put in place in, I think, 2003, 2004, as the ban was in the process of being lifted? So Walmart? Show of hands, who thinks it's Walmart? No. Alibaba, one there, Alibaba maybe, JD, Sam's Club. All right, I'll rid you of the suspense yet again here, Tress, but it was Senator Steve Daines on his Codell from that he led last year to China. Our deputy chief of staff, actually I should say really it was Wally, his name's Wally, so not Walmart, but Wally was the first person to really bring our first shipment of beef over to China. But shipped that over, we snuck it over on our Codell and our Mill airplane in a probably China-made Coleman's cooler, and snuck it past security and handed it to the premier of China. They weren't sure if they were getting fingers or thumbs or what they were getting, but it was a good Montana steak. And that was right before we managed to see that ban was lifted and begin the process of importing U.S. beef again in China. But I've now meandered so far in a story. Tress, what exactly was the question you wanted to?
What are the negative? What are,
stories are so much better.
They are better.
You can't get in trouble as much.
But what are the negative consequences if we don't get it right?
Well, in Montana, and keep in mind, Montana borders Canada. In fact, we have the largest border with Canada of any state in the nation. But the number one export services country where we have services export in the world from Montana is the place that's probably nearly the furthest away. It's China, followed by Canada, and that's largely driven by the massive amount of tourism to our wonderful national parks in Montana. China is third and rising. Probably this year it'll be second, would be my guess, with regards to goods exports. So the market opportunity for egg-related states, you mentioned your district's the number one most trade-dependent district in the nation. If you look at something like NAFTA, Montana, I think, ranks number one with regards to who wins the most from a trade deal like that. When we look at what's going on in the world today with trades and tariffs, the U.S. has some of the lowest tariffs with agricultural goods in the world. We don't have much to offer the rest of the world as it relates to further lowering barriers to entry to export agricultural goods around the world. So we very much need countries like China to be doing that if we're going to be finding new markets to access to that other 96% of the world. I won't touch on the more cataclysmic, but we have there's one of the things that comes up it didn't come up in this trip that I took most recently to China with my boss, but it was a conversation that came up at nearly every level of government, called referring to a book that was written here on the Thucydides trap of the sort of the inevitable conflict between a rising power and over a existing superpower, and that has led to war in something like 13 out of 16 times in history that you have seen that phenomenon. But you definitely see very much a clash of rival rules-based systems here of what's going on, and the opportunity just simply for error and misjudgment to really create a chaotic world, and overall for our system of trade that has been great for the prosperity of the world, lifted so many people out of poverty, and been so great for America, very much I think is at risk even outside of the more sort of dramatic scenarios here that I think are probably pretty unlikely, but seeing our system of trade in a global-based system fall down and fall apart certainly I think is a very real threat right now.
Thanks. Before I get accused of dominating the microphone, any questions from the room? And if not, Tara, I do have one more for you. This is somewhat leading because I've heard you talk about it before. But what can we in industry, in business who have investments and engagements in China, what can we do better to help tell this story about the importance of economic relationships between our two markets?
Sure, and you've heard Rick speak about this as well. I think when Rick last spoke about it, he said he can't force CEOs to tell their board members what to do, but there does seem to be a lot of silence on industry as far as trade in general, whether it be NAFTA or China, and I don't know if it's because of the tax cut. I don't know why. I don't know if it's because of fear of retaliation, but there definitely seems to be more silence. There is a small group of Democrats in the House called the New Democrats, which are generally pro-trade Democrats, and they're probably the most vocal group right now about some of these tactics and strategies on trade. Again, these are pro-trade Democrats, generally like trade, but they are speaking out against these policies because we see these consequences and we understand the importance of trade, but not only trade, but this rule-based order that seems to be escaping this administration. So these 28 to 56 Democrats can continue to speak up all they want, but it would be great to have other voices and have a broader group of people that speak out against some of these policies, or at least join coalitions to try to find a better way forward, even if it's not outright speaking out, would be my suggestion.
All right, thank you. I think that's part and parcel of why many of us are here today, to have this conversation and find and identify that appropriate path forward and find a way to have constructive dialogues and foster constructive conversations between our two countries. If there are no final questions there's one in the back.
Hi, how are you? Sarah with Walmart. It seems that the Trump administration has taken a lot of delegated authority on trade policy and is in some ways using it in ways that might not have been anticipated by Congress. Is your sense that there is any appetite for Congress to relook at some of those delegated authorities to think about what's the right balance between Congress and the administration on trade policy?
This is the Democratic, pro-trade Democratic side. I would say yes, a large appetite. I first started following trade when I volunteered on President Clinton's re-election campaign in '96, and it used to be or seemed to be that the administration kind of pulled Congress along as far as trade is concerned, and that dynamic has shifted. So I think how Congress's approach to trade with this administration, or the Democratic side anyway, with pro-trade Democratic side, because I think there are lots of Democrats that like what this administration is doing on trade. I think when it comes to that core group of people, there's going to be lots of discussions of how they engage, how they weigh in, and discussions in Congress of changing this dynamic a little bit more and putting more power back into Congress and the Article I authority of the Constitution.
I think it's Senator Lee, it could be Cruz, but I believe it's Senator Lee has a bill which would reassert Congress will actually take power away from the executive as it relates to decisions on withdrawing from trade agreements, as I recall. It has one person on the bill, that would be Senator Lee.
But there's a House bill as well that Meeks
Maybe
and
that one
Kind,
has some more. Yeah,
Meeks
okay.
and Kind just dropped about congressional review authority. So I think that this is starting, this conversation is, even if it's just one or two, I think the conversation's starting to happen.
Thank you. Any other questions? Just one in the back.
I spent about 12 years in China with USDA, and I left USDA a couple years ago, but it kind of breaks my heart, all of the things that are happening right now with this trade war. I was just wondering if you see the Trump administration kind of fixing the TPP and putting that back on the table, which might be a way for both sides to, go back and not lose face and give us more leverage over China on some of the difficulties we have in China with trade. Do you see that as a possibility, or who knows? No.
Senator Daines was at the White House last month with a handful of members, mostly from farm states, and he put that question to the president as a follow-up to the remarks that were made. I believe it actually, I don't know if it was a tweet or I think maybe it was remarks at Davos, that perhaps we'd be open to relooking at that. He directed at that time the USTR and the Treasury Secretary to reinvestigate the potential of doing so. So there was a glimmer of hope in that regard, but it seemed like that was walked back fairly quickly. But I think if you look at the developments, frankly, today on what the posture is with how we're going to approach a potential deal with China, I don't think you can rule out, and I think going to your point, that is an area where I think it's important that the business community continue to reiterate the importance of that. And I think it's always know your audience. You need to speak to things in a way that's persuasive to the person that you're listening to whom you are trying to persuade, not yourself. And to the president, what is persuasive, I think, in regards to that, and certainly to other members of his administration, is the national security implications and what the opportunity is for the United States for us to win.
I don't think the United States is going to get back into TPP under this administration. President Trump made one of his very first decisions after being sworn in the White House of getting out of TPP. I think that if there was a glimmer of hope, I think it was false hope. I do believe that there's a lot of people in Congress, Senator Daines, Congressman Larson, that believe we should get back into TPP and will continue pushing. I just don't see it in this administration at all. I hope I'm wrong.
Glass half full, glass half empty. Right?
Exactly. All right, any final questions? If not, Jason, Tara, thank you so much for being here today. We appreciate your insights, and thank you for representing the classes.